This is the second part of my game against David Moore. So we ended up in this endgame, which we had to play with about a minute per move, because that was the time controls. We basically had no time left whatsoever, and all the time we had was the increment that we were getting. So the endgame was pretty complicated as well, and both me and my opponent thought that our position was better. He thought that black is better here because of his central pawns, and I thought that my position was better because my rook was a bit more active, and my bishop was supposed to be better in a position like this where there are pawns on both flanks. In particular, I thought that this pawn here is not really a weakness, it's more of a strength. It's going to distract my opponent from the center, and it's going to be easy for me to support this pawn with the bishop. But we'll see what happened. Objectively, the position's roughly equal. So first, I tied up his rook to the defense of the a pawn, kind of, and I start to activate my king, and black advances the pawn in the center, which is very natural. So I try to prevent him from advancing immediately with his king. He has to go to f6, and now rook b5 is a good move because it keeps the rook on the b file, and it may later go to b8, or there's another idea which we'll see soon, that comes from the rook being on the b file. The pawn is being attacked, but that's okay. Now the bishop is attacked, it just retreats, and now the bishop here stands quite well. It's going to defend the pawn on h5, and it's going to block the e-pawn if it ever tries to advance right away. And that gives white a bit of time. And black here misjudged the position a little bit. He decided that he has time to go around and win the h-pawn. It turns out there really isn't enough time for that. But because of his misconception, he wasted several moves trying to surround that pawn with the knight and the king, and in the end it turned out that he still cannot capture it. And that gave me time to advance the a-pawn all the way to a6. And now this seems like a bad idea. Why am I putting the pawn on the same color as the bishop in this endgame? But it turns out that there are also rooks on the board, and with the rooks on the board I have a very simple idea, just to play rook to b7, and then how is he going to guard the a7 pawn? If the pawn falls, the h-pawn is already in a very good position to advance further. So this grouping of pawns here on the queen side is really to white's advantage, and this gives white pretty good winning chances actually at this point. So knight to f6, I kind of overlooked the defense here that he came up with. I thought I'm going to be completely winning. But his idea is that he doesn't trade, he doesn't lose the a-pawn, instead he just retreats along the 7th rank. All I could think of here is that if he goes knight e8, then I can play bishop b5. He's forced to either, well, surrender the rook, surrender the knight, or take on b7, and then the a-pawn would advance. So I thought this is a slam dunk, but it wasn't, because in the game, instead, he kept the rook on the 7th rank, and when I try to attack the rook, he just keeps it on the 7th rank. And after a few moves, he actually offered me a draw. But of course, still the e-pawn is very dangerous, and I felt like I could play on here. In particular, now that my bishop and rook are very active and playing well, of course it's time to activate the king. So I thought, well, I'm just going to bring the king over to c6. There's no defense against that. Black is just very tied up. He can't take on h5, he can't take on b7. The rook can't leave the 7th rank. This has to be good. And it actually was. King a4. Black's only counter plan is to advance the pawn in the center. Finally he gets around to do this. And this is also good for him because there's very few pawns left on the board, and if he can just trade off most of them, it's going to be a draw. So d4, the threat of d4 facilitates that. Finally comes in. Here I had a decision to make. Can I simplify into the minor piece endgame and then just win the a-pawn and win the game that way? And I overlooked a very simple thing here. with only 1 minute left on the clock at all times, I completely missed that I have two rook pawns, and one of them is of the wrong color. So even if I have a bishop and that pawn, and the king gets to the corner, I can't win. And I kept thinking that, well, I have a good a-pawn. The a-pawn is of the right color. It's a really dangerous pawn. And I completely forgot that the h-pawn is actually bad, and I have no other pawns left on the board. So here, I had some really good winning chances that I could have kept if I played king c6, and then the main line goes roughly like this: d3, counterattacks, but I'm going to be winning the a-pawn, and this position is still very complicated, but white is probably winning here. Still, he will have black will have threats of advancing the d-pawn. Let's say after something like this, white's probably winning because he has the a-pawn is still a major threat. He still hasn't lost the h-pawn, and he's up a pawn. But this would have been, of course, still quite challenging. This was definitely the way to play and pose problems to my opponent. Instead, I simplified with rook to d7, and after knight d7, it turned out that I'm just too late. After king c6, he played d3. Another trick is that if I take, well, then the h-pawn falls, or he could maybe give a fork, or he could do what he did in the game, give up the knight for the a-pawn. Bishop d1, knight f6, and here my opponent played knight f6, and I thought, oh, he doesn't realize that all he has to do is just play something like knight b8 check, and then this is a draw, because the h-pawn is of the wrong color. The king can just hide on h8, and I won't be able to break through and force him out of the corner. But for a second he didn't realize that. So instead of all this, he played knight to f6, and I thought, oh, maybe I still have a chance. Because if he doesn't realize that he just has to give up the knight for the a-pawn, then of course I'm winning. But after king b7, unfortunately, you realize that it's all very simple. I win the a-pawn, but he just has to give up the knight for the a-pawn, and then I can't force the king out of that corner. It's just going to be going, let's say, it's just going to be staying on the g7 and the h8 squares, and I won't be able to force him out. And because of that, the game is a draw. So this was a very interesting game with very complex middle game, and we didn't have enough time to play the endgame well, but I thought it was still interesting that in the drawn position I got some winning chances, and it was probably winning because of the strength of the bishop. But in the end, of course, it was a draw because my bishop was of the wrong color with respect to the passed pawn, and I couldn't win.